Okay, so I said that I want to go over a brief reason concerning this mind or soul separation from the body, and one maybe non-religious reason. So you could imagine, I suppose, that one reason that a Catholic like Descartes would like to uphold a certain kind of idea about the mind or the soul being separate from the body is that it gives credence to the idea, it gives kind of conceptual space or room to the notion that if the soul is really separate from the body, perhaps the soul is actually immortal. That once we leave this earthly existence, it's possible that who I am or who we are could live on, at least in the form of having a mind or being a soul. And so that's a kind of general reason why it is that there could be a kind of religious motivation or a religious kind of outgrowth of this idea. And so I think that people who are religious might find that attractive. Some of them at least. But of course, not everybody has this kind of religious idea or this theological idea about the mind or the soul. And so we might wonder, can this idea between the mind-body separation still be motivated? And I think that it can. Here's here's what I mean by this. Suppose if you can think of, I mentioned a few movies last time. I had mentioned The Matrix and The Truman Show and Inception. If you've ever seen anything like a Freaky Friday movie, uh, the premise, and there's different variations on the Freaky Friday genre, but the basic premise of a Freaky Friday genre movie is that, say, in the original, a mother and a daughter switch bodies. And the moral of these is always something like, well, it's so hard to understand what the life of someone else is like. But once they switch bodies and they have to go through their lives for some period of time, they come to realize the kinds of trials and tribulations and hardships and what life is like overall to be that other person. And then eventually, by some magic or one another, they revert back to their original body. Or think of something like Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, in which the main character, Gregor Samsa, wakes up one day and finds himself in the body of a bug, or something like a large bug. And you're sitting here reading the short story, and it's in the voice of the author, and you understand the way in which he's writing the story and how surprised he is. And yet, when the character Gregor Samsa is trying to communicate with his family outside of his bedroom, all they hear are bug noises. They can't understand him at all. And so, the point isn't so much that these are obviously fictional kinds of examples. The point is that even for somebody who doesn't have a religious kind of understanding of soul and body separation, the point is that even for someone like that, you can still understand. It's still intelligible for you. These stories are still intelligible in the sense that they make sense. They're not completely alien or completely foreign ideas. Even if we don't think that they could be possible, we still think that we understand them. And insofar as we just understand the very notion or the very idea that, say, a mind and a body could be separate things, that seems to give credence to what Descartes is after in this kind of metaphysical implication, in this metaphysical dualism. And there are other ways that we could talk about this, involving, say, mental pain that people feel and the perhaps impossibility of others actually feeling mental pain, the mental pain that you feel. There are other thoughts that people have. People have this thought sometimes as children. They say, well, maybe I'm looking at like a folder or a certain kind of plant, and I see this plant as being green. And yet, what if my conscious experience is completely different than somebody else's conscious experience? What if I see this plant as green, being green, but somebody else actually, in their conscious experience, sees it as being red? And yet we both call it green. We call it by the same name. It seems as though our conscious experience can be completely different. We're totally separated in these ways. And so that example is called an inverted spectrum example. Okay, so there is this kind of metaphysical dualism that Descartes comes to when discussing these meditations. Let me say one more thing about meditation 2 before we turn to meditation 3. Near the end of meditation 2, I hope you saw this example with a piece of wax. And we might ask ourselves, well, why is Descartes talking about a piece of wax? And here's why. Suppose he says, here's what appears to be a piece of wax. And it has, again, all these aspects. It's golden yellow in color. At the moment, it is rigid. When I rasp it, it makes a certain kind of sound. It tastes and it smells a certain way. And yet, if I put this piece of wax near the fire, it seems as though it changes all of its properties in virtue of being melted. So it changes its entire bodily structure. It doesn't smell and it wouldn't taste it in the same fashion. You can't rasp it anymore. It loses its color. It's no longer golden yellow. It's closer to a milky white. And all told, every sensible property of this thing, of this piece of wax, has changed. And yet, Descartes says, everyone would still call it the same piece of wax, despite the changes in all of its sensible properties. No one would say otherwise, he claims. And so, in using this example, what he's trying to show is that when we're talking about the unity of an object, or the way in which an object can remain the same over or through time, what we are doing is actually judging or using a kind of intellectual perception as opposed to a sense perception, an intellectual perception with your mind's eye, as it were, to understand the unity and the sameness of an object. It's in virtue of a kind of judgment. He also gives the quick example of, what, say, being on, say, the 4th or 5th story of the building and looking down at the street. And from his perspective, all he can see, he says, are top hats and coats. He doesn't actually see people underneath those top hats and coats. And yet, so there's nothing about this experience in terms of his sense experience which suggests that there are actually people there. And yet he says, I nonetheless intellectually perceive, I nonetheless judge that these are people. And so it's in virtue of a kind of judgment, again, an intellectual activity, that we understand the unity of an object. And so what he says here is that if I can do this with something, if I can understand how the piece of wax is the same, if I can do this with something which is external to me, all the more can I say that I understand who I am as being a unified thinking thing. Because I am a kind of transparent and conscious being, as opposed to something which is beyond what I am, something external to me. And so this is the reason that he brings out the piece of wax example in meditation 2. Okay, so those are the highlights, at least that I wanted to emphasize with meditation 2. But now we have the major question, which has gone unexplained so far. Why does he move from this foundation in meditation 2 to attempting to prove God's existence in meditation number 3? And here are a couple of major reasons. Let's call these the 2 motivations. For meditation 3. So here's the first one. If you recall up to this point, even if he's proven that he exists, I think therefore I am, and he has a foundation, and he conceives of it as a kind of unity of the subject. That doesn't mean that anyone else exists. It also doesn't mean that the physical world exists either. Remember, those are still doubtable. If I can doubt my senses, I can surely doubt whether other people exist. After all, I see them and I hear them and so on. And I can doubt all kinds of things about the physical world. And so, one reason for meditation 3 is that he wants to escape what's called solipsism. And solipsism is just a term for a kind of philosophical view or belief that I am the only thing that exists. So one reason for meditation 3 is to escape solipsism. It's a kind of position that basically nobody wants to be in. It wouldn't be very plausible, for instance, if one were a solipsist. Here's the other motivation. There is still a kind of skeptical concern that Descartes has, lurking in the background. Because even in the piece of wax example, he has perhaps an idea of that piece of wax as he's using it for a particular purpose to identify the unity of the object. And when we look at things in the world, bicycles or folders or coffee cups and so on, well, it's not as if those things are actually in our minds. It's not as if a bicycle is actually in my mind. An idea of a bicycle is in my mind. And I want to know, Descartes says, I want to know if my ideas actually match up with things that are out in the world. I want to know if my idea of a bicycle accurately matches up with, or in the way he thinks about it, accurately represents the thing out there in the world, if the idea of the bicycle actually matches the bicycle. And so one way he puts this is that it seems as though he can gain some clarity and distinctness. He calls them clear and distinct ideas. He wants to know if the ideas about which he gains clarity and distinctness, like he's already gained clarity and distinctness about himself, about the I, and he's gained clarity and distinctness about the unity of objects. He's come to some kind of understanding of them, some kind of insight. He still wants to know if those clear and distinct ideas are actually true, really true. And so it's in virtue of those two motivations that Descartes takes up the topic of meditation 3. Because if it's the case that he can prove that God exists, that is going to solve both of these problems. Here's why. If God exists, then he's shown that he is not the only thing that exists in the world, Descartes. Something else exists, namely God. And so if he can prove that God exists, then he can escape solipsism. Likewise, if God exists, he can know, he says, that his clear and distinct ideas are actually true. They actually represent, accurately, bicycles out in the world, or things out in the world. And that's because of a property that God has, one that came up before. It's because God is all good. And God would not allow Descartes, he claims, to be systematically deceived about those ideas with which he has worked to gain clarity and distinctness. And so in virtue of God being all good or omnibenevolent, he would not allow Descartes to be deceived in this way, and therefore he can know that those ideas at least are true. So those are the motivations. We will take up the proof of God's existence in just a moment.